Hi, good day everyone. I am Shaina Derecho together with my partner Aliana Carolina. We will be discussing Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, specifically paragraph 1 to 27 and 66 to 71. Before we start, let us first discuss the brief biography of Ludwig Josef Johann Wittgenstein. He was born on April 26, 1889 in Vienna, Austria. He studied aeronautical engineering at Manchester University. Gottlob Frege, a German philosopher, advised him to take up philosophy, in which Ludwig in 1911 went to Cambridge and studied with Bertrand Russell. His notable works are Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus and Philosophical Investigations. His subjects of study are certainty, proposition, picture theory of meaning, and language game. Now, let us proceed to the discussion proper, in which Aliana will introduce us to the general idea of philosophical investigations.
For Wittgenstein, philosophy is not a theory, and it is not a doctrine either, but rather it's an activity. It's an activity of clarification of thoughts, and more so, of critique of language. As described by Wittgenstein, it should be a philosopher's routine activity to react or to respond to the traditional philosopher's thinking by showing them where they go wrong. In other words, showing them that some of their propositions are indeed nonsense. Wittgenstein wanted to distinguish between what was sense and nonsense. In most cases, the meaning of a word is its use. Wittgenstein said in the most famous passage in the reading, Philosophical Investigations, "The truth is, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, and the context in which you say it. Words are how you use them." Wittgenstein's philosophy's point of view goes beyond linguistics and more into ethnography. In order to communicate with the social tribe, listen to how they use their language. In many cases, slang, banter, and jokes are not poorly structured secondary forms of communication, but rather they're coded means of exchanges within a community. So why am I discussing this? This is a philosophy class, not an English class. Well, you see, Wittgenstein's view on language is also important for anyone engaging in philosophy. Take the word God, for example. The contemporary debate between atheists and believers is premised on the idea that the word God represents something in this world, or it doesn't. Believers argue that it does. Atheists argue that it doesn't. In the Wittgensteinian approach to debate, it begins by pointing out the word God and realizing that the word God has different meanings in the context of different communities. In the context of different linguistic communities, people use the word God in different ways to articulate experiences. An example could be, "I felt the presence of God." Another way of thinking about the meaning of God, therefore, is to see how other people use this term as a move in a social language game, a move that ideally has specific connotations for members of a community. Wittgenstein's teaching has practical value. Why waste time arguing over issues that will never be resolved when the whole thing could be deflated with a simple question? Are we even talking about the same thing? When you think of the word language, what do you think its essence is? What do they have in common, all languages? See, they all have a common mechanism, which is words. All languages have words. What about the essence of a word? Well, words are sounds in speech, in graphics of letters, and even sign language. Compared to a violin, words are comprehensible, which makes them different from the rest. In the quotation of St. Augustine, in the first part of the book, he was describing the stages that a child goes through when they learn their very first words. This was his take on language. The words stand for the object it represents. Adults name an object, and the child perceives the sounds and signifies the object, which will equal the words. Soon enough, the child will become a fluent speaker in that language. He basically believes that every word has a meaning, and this meaning is correlated with the word, which is honestly easy to agree with. It is essential to bridge the gap between the sound and word, but there's an argument that there's actually no such entity that a meaning exists. See, what seems to be the gap in this view is that it doesn't mention the other different kinds of words, like pain. Can you point out what pain is? The same way you can point out what the word table is, or a football, or even bread. Wittgenstein provided an example in which a person is sent out to go shopping and is provided a slip that says 5 red apples. He then gives the slip to the shop owner, who then opens a box marked apples, then looks at the table that shows the color sample of red. Afterwards, the shop owner counts 1 to 5 for each number he gets a red apple. This poses the question: how is the shop owner to know that it is red and what it has to do with the number 5? Well, the label on the box that stated apples and the color red that showed helped in identifying the object, but not the number 5. The number 5 was not given a meaning, but it was understood based on how it's used, and that is by counting. It does not refer to something, but rather it refers how something is done. This example shows us how we operate with words. It is also an analogy on how they function rather on how they're learned. The nature of language is ambiguous and not straightforward, which is why you need more preparation to make sure you're using it correctly. It proves that, in contrary to the Augustinian view, it shows that meaning may not be anything but a figment of imagination, which is through counting. In conclusion, he believes that the Augustinian view works in a small part of a language region, and not all. Therefore, it is oversimplified. Wittgenstein believes that language and meaning are much more complicated than that. As mentioned earlier, Wittgenstein's view of language differ from St. Augustine's. Again, St. Augustine's view suggests that words name objects and names make up a sentence. In simple terms, words and names are associated with an object, but as Wittgenstein states, this kind of description does not address that there is a difference between kinds of words. For better understanding, let us use an example close to Wittgenstein's in the second paragraph. In this example, a mother is cooking a dish, and the child is the assistant. Picture that the child attends to what the mother asks for in the order that she needs them. For this reason, they use a language that consists of pot, ladle, frying pan, and spatula. The mother shouts the words, and the child brings the object which they have learned to identify and bring when the words are called out to them. Wittgenstein believes that this is the primitive idea of how language functions. From the word primitive, it means that it's the earliest or ancient way of how people use language. Ostensive teaching is teaching that words can be said to establish an associative connection between a word and a thing. One might mean various things by this associative connection, but most likely, a child will imagine a picture of the object in their mind. Children learn what different words signify because they're trained to obey orders as well as learn to express their desires. So how is the word this and there taught ostensibly? It is taught by pointing out things or places. When they picture something when they hear a word, is it the purpose of the word? In some cases. But in the language of the child in the previous situation, words said by the mother were meant to produce actions. In conclusion, ostensive teaching alone is not enough. Instruction must be taken into account as well. Different instruction would result in a different understanding of what the word is. So how is the word this and there taught ostensibly. It is taught by pointing out things or places. When they picture something when they hear a word, is it the purpose of the word? In some cases. But in the language of the child in the previous situation, words said by the mother were meant to produce actions. In conclusion, ostensive teaching alone is not enough. Instruction must be taken into account as well. Different instruction would result in a different understanding of what the word is. Given the example of the mom and child from the previous example, Wittgenstein asks if this is the appropriate description of language, in which he answers, yes, it is. But it does not generalize or apply to all that it signifies. It still depends on the distinction and context we apply to it. And this is where language games enter the picture. The language game is a philosophical concept made by Wittgenstein in which you learn to speak the language, you speak the language, and you do activities revolving using that language. You see, this is more than just speaking. There are a lot of things to consider. The similarities between a game and a language, which is the reason why it's called a language game, is that there are two people who have roles and both do actions to achieve a certain goal. In the context of language, there are a lot of rules to have to be in place for a word to have a use. Its meaning depends on what rules there are in the game a person plays, because not all games are the same way not all languages are the same.
Now, let us move on to the next key point. Wittgenstein criticizes Frege's idea that every assertion contains an assumption. It gives an idea that an assertion consists of two actions, namely entertaining and asserting the truth value of an object, in which Wittgenstein states that there are many different kinds of use of words, symbols, and sentences out there that are not only confined with the two actions. The multiplicity of language is not fixed, but new types of language and language games may come while others become forgotten or outdated. For example, a person might say something, but another person may take it the wrong way. In relation to this, proper use of punctuation marks are important to give more context to the topic being discussed. For instance, a person says, "It's dark." Does this insinuate that the person is scared? Or is it a cry for help? Is it "I can see"? Or maybe a direct statement as it is? For the next key point, we have naming. Naming something does not automatically give clarification to the meaning of the name. It cannot be just giving an ostensible definition. This means that it cannot just be pointed out or be demonstrated. This also involves language games, in which it refers to a type of use or context, but not to an object. For example, aray, os, naks, we, idol. These words do not pertain to an object, but rather there is an intention or context involved. Now, let us discuss the key points of paragraphs 66 to 71. There is no general form of propositions. Wittgenstein states that logical truths is an illusion. The thing we call language are related to one another, but they do not all share a fixed characteristic. Language is like a game. Just like games, there's no exact meaning. But there are a number of similarities between kinds of games. Wittgenstein calls the similarity between different kinds of games a family resemblance, because a family is also identifiable by certain similarities in features. We do not need exact definitions. A lot of times, we can know what a word means without being able to give an exact definition. A word with definite meaning means it plays by exact rules, but these do not provide certainty. Rules can always be misinterpreted and not always necessary because word usage or language games are unregulated. Now we're going to analyze paragraphs 1 to 27. In the first part, Augustine explains how he came to learn language and the picture of language that Wittgenstein reads into. He is showing what is wrong with the way that Augustine reasons. Wittgenstein introduces language games to counter this tendency. Rather than study what all language games have in common, Wittgenstein shows us how much language games can differ. The point of this was to show the sense between words and things within the wider context of language. For paragraphs 66 to 71, Wittgenstein states that he opposes the thought that everything has exact meaning regardless of their context, and that we actually learn what a word means because we know how to use that word in certain contexts. Wittgenstein was the first to talk about the importance of rules and use them in relation to fixity of meaning. There are two ways in which definition of words are just like rules in a game. First, the rules of a game do not cover all cases. Rules and boundaries are only clear when dealing with the situations we are familiar with, but it does not cover all possible situations. Second, Wittgenstein's point is not that rules are useless, but that there is a point where we simply follow a rule without any explicit justification.
In conclusion, Wittgenstein believes in the powerful example of the skill of interpretation. Philosophical problems often arise from the confusion in the use of language, and a way to solve these problems, Wittgenstein hypothesizes, is by clarifying language use. He argues that philosophers must study ordinary uses of language and example how people use it as a tool in their everyday lives. In this way, the meaning of a word or sentence becomes relative to context, like with people, culture, and the society in which it is used.
These investigations are grammatical. We seek to remove misunderstandings that may come from analogies drawn between different forms of expression, among other things. But we should not think these investigations lead us toward exactness in language. In most cases, language does not need to be more exact than it already is. In everyday conversations, we must make sure that we are in the same context of language use when we are engaged in a certain topic with another person or group of people. This helps to avoid misunderstanding and promote a healthy discourse.
This ends our presentation. Here are our references.
Hello, this has been your reporters, Shaina and Alyana, and we hope that you learned something about philosophical investigations by Ludwig Wittgenstein, and we hope that you like the lecture that we gave for today. Thank you for listening.